know the basic gist. A massive volcano erupted in the Bay of Naples and killed thousands, right? Not quite. The story is a little bit bigger than that. This is the only step-by-step timeline of the day that Vesuvius erupted over Pompeii that you need. And it's going to go through everything hour by hour. This includes the conditions of the eruption, the date, not the one you know, what people did to escape and how many actually survived. I'm also going to tell you about an eyewitness account. Yes, an eyewitness account from the time. And also life in the city after the eruption, because there actually was one. I've put over 10 years of my life into researching Pompeii before and after the eruption. I'm Dr. Jess Venner. I'm an ancient historian and an archaeologist and also a Pompeianist, so no one is better to guide you through the day of the eruption than me. And I am tapped into the archaeologists and the people working on the site now on digs. So I am the first to hear when something happens, which means that you too will be the first to hear when something comes out next. This is the definitive guide that you need. You don't need another. Should we get going? In AD 79, a volcano called Vesuvius erupted on the Bay of Naples. And over the course of just a day, this ferociously destructive eruption wiped out cities for miles around, including, you guessed it, Pompeii and Herculaneum, and thousands were killed. But what actually happened from the first minute of the first explosion to the final part of the eruption on the following day? And how can we know? I've always been fascinated by the concept of Pompeii as frozen in time, but this is actually a misconception, and we'll discover this together over the timeline of the eruption. The stages of the eruption in Pompeii are the thing I get asked about the most often. What was it like to be there? Did anyone survive? Did people escape? Why were their bodies preserved there? And why do we have so much remaining? So I've done the work for you. I've gone through hundreds of books and resources to bring you this ultimate timeline of the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79 in Pompeii. So let's get going. The quiet before the storm. In the run up to the eruption, it was just another normal day in Pompeii. People were going about their day, opening their shops, taking their horses down the road with their carts full of fruit and vegetables and wine and other lovely things. And there were tremors. This is the first sign of the eruption that's about to happen. So earthquakes had been happening throughout time. Small tremors up to big ones. In AD 62, a huge earthquake hit Pompeii and it took out a lot of its infrastructure. A lot of buildings fell down. People were injured and some were probably killed as well. This happened sometime around February in AD 62 or AD 63, depending on whose literary accounts you believe, and it was a magnitude of between 5 and 6 on the scale, so it was quite big. It took out a lot of the town and a lot of buildings were destroyed. People were injured and disorientated afterwards, not knowing what to do with themselves, but ultimately they were very used to this happening in Campania, which is the region where we're looking at the moment. So we've got Pompeii over here and we've got Herculaneum here. We hear about this in the ancient writers. They write about this earthquake, and actually we have it in the archaeological record as well. So Pompeii is actually further away from the volcano and Herculaneum is closer, but they're all on the Bay of Naples. We actually have a record for the AD 62 earthquake. It's found in the house of Caecilius Jucundus, and he was a banker, so he had lots of records. But in the atrium or the courtyard of his house, we actually have a marble frieze that depicts the earthquake in AD 62 or 3, and you can see some statues wobbling about because they're hit by this tremor. So clearly he thought this was an important enough event to record inside his home. There may be a reason it's on an altar as well. Perhaps he was giving dedications to prevent this from happening again. And all the while, over the town loomed a massive mountain, Mount Vesuvius. He had no idea what was about to happen on a very special date to come. And this brings me to point 2, the date. It's a normal day in the town of Pompeii in October. Wait. Hasn't the date of the eruption always been 24th of August AD 79? Historians did think this for a long time, but there's loads of evidence to suggest that this isn't actually the case at all. One of the strongest was found in a house in 2018, and it's actually some charcoal on a wall, charcoal writing or graffiti. So, of course, they read this, translated it, and it said 17th of October in the year of AD 79. Now, the fact that it's written in charcoal means that it wouldn't have lasted very long, so it was written recently. It was actually going on around restoration works in the house, so they were probably referring to some works going on there at that time. Add to this as well that there's autumn fruits that are coming out, the harvest had already happened, lots and lots of other things, including scientific advancements in this area, which all tell us as archaeologists that this was not the date, but it's more likely in October. Now I'm coming on to point 3, the eruption begins. Okay, so we've got the morning of 24th of October, AD 79. What happened? It was a normal day. We're in the morning right now, around 11 to 12. People are getting their shops open, they're trading, they're going to see their friends. They finished the morning meeting, the salutatio, at clients' houses. So these were very important people in the community. You'd have patrons of them, which is where this comes from. And then, bang! An almighty explosion. As the people in Pompeii look up into the sky, they see a huge column of black ash rising into the sky. This reached 20 kilometres or 12.43 miles high. Now, to put this into context, Canadian scientists are currently producing a lift, or at least trying to, that's going to go up to space. And this is about the same height as the column of ash that went above Vesuvius. The Burj Khalifa, which is the highest building in the whole world, is 830 metres. And you would need 24 of these put on top of one another to reach the height that the column above Vesuvius hit. Now, an eyewitness account to this eruption, which I'll tell you about very shortly, said to us that this column went up and out like a plane tree. This, of course, allowed pumice and ash to rain down on the towns around Vesuvius. Some of these were absolutely massive and people were being crushed under their weight. And of course, this column of ash was blocking out the sun. Absolutely petrifying. The records from the time were telling us that it was very, very dark. On this day, the wind was blowing in a southeasterly direction, and by midday, the ash had begun to fall to the east, covering Pompeii, which is just 6 miles away. And Herculaneum, which is, as I said, much closer, is getting hit, but not as much yet. They didn't actually know that Vesuvius was a volcano. Some writers had had some inklings about it, but nobody really knew what it was. They thought it was a mountain. Over the next hour, pumice is raining down at a rate of about 10 to 15 centimetres per hour. And as we'll see, this eventually reached ridiculous heights. So you're probably wondering by now already, what were the people of Pompeii doing? Well, this brings me to point 4, trying to escape. Something I'm asked so often is, did people escape and did they actually have any time to? Well, the answer is yes and yes. So the population at the time of the eruption, we think the best estimate that we have is about 20,000 people. People could have walked out of the town if they'd wanted to. But the thing I'll say is that they didn't know what was going on. They thought the gods were probably up to this, and they probably thought that it would stop. They were used to the tremors, as we've learned. They weren't going to think necessarily there was anything to escape from. But as time went on, the reality probably hit, and they probably thought, right, now is the time to go. But if you'll remember, the pumice is rising, and things are falling from the sky even more and more often. It's dark, it's loud, there's people screaming, there's people in the way, there's debris, there's buildings falling down. Are you going to escape through this easily? Probably not. So we actually have horses that were yoked, ready to go. If they were going to go across pumice, that was a very difficult thing to do. A lot of them had carts put on them, again, couldn't escape. We also have elderly and pregnant women who clearly felt like they couldn't escape. We know they were pregnant because some of them were found with, unfortunately, a fetus inside, so the skeletons of a baby and mother. But we've also got the people to consider that didn't have anywhere to go. Where would they go? This is where their home was. And actually, I've asked people in the Bay of Naples, why do you live here if you've got Mount Vesuvius right there? You know what could happen? And they say, well, my home's here, my family's here, I grew up here, my business is here. Why would I go anywhere else? So this is something that we need to keep in mind here. This isn't necessarily an option for people to leave. We've also got a lot of people with keys in their pockets, and of course you wouldn't leave the house without a key. But there were a lot of lock boxes as well that had been locked up with treasure and gold and jewellery and beautiful items from the home like silver cups inside. They were clearly hoping to come back for these, so they just bunged it all in there when the eruption was happening, hoping to come back at a later date, which I think is one of the most devastating things to me. They also had money on them, not a lot of the time, but you know, enough to get by. By now, very, very dark. We've got rocks falling at a speed of about 50 meters per second. We've got people trying to escape over the pumice, getting higher and higher at this point, and over the next few hours up until about 11 p.m. this is going to continue to happen. Roofs are still falling in, columns and buildings are still falling down. Anyone that didn't want to escape at the early stages of the eruption around midday are now starting to think, this is my time, I have to go, this is clearly not going to stop. And it gets worse, which brings me to point 5, the peak of the eruption. Now, the eruption column that I mentioned earlier has now reached 33 kilometers in the air. Let me just find out what miles that is. This is 20 miles. So yeah, it's the same as I said earlier. So it's hit a peak of 20 miles high in the sky. And this is incredibly heavy, as you can imagine. It's got all sorts going on in it. So it's going to collapse, and it does. And this is where we come to the stage you may have heard of with the pyroclastic surges. Now let me explain what a pyroclastic surge is. A pyroclastic surge is where, in this case, the column got so heavy for itself that it collapsed on itself, and the ash and pumice and hot gas fell down the column, down the volcano, and out into the towns surrounding. The speeds and the heat were phenomenal. They were reaching up to 570 degrees Fahrenheit or 300 degrees Celsius. Anyone hit by these would be killed instantly, which is some consolation. There wouldn't be time to be suffocated, essentially. They would be killed by the heat immediately. So these flows are not only killing people and animals, but they're also destroying buildings in their wake. The Pompeii we know today, with all the walls up, a lot of that was being taken down because of the force of this pyroclastic flow. Now if we go over to Herculaneum. Herculaneum, as I said, was closer, so you're probably thinking, hold on a minute, that's getting hit harder. Yes, it is, at higher heats. So different things were going on there. And this is why we've got furniture and things that are carbonized in Herculaneum. And this is where the oxygen has been taken out of the materials. Wood, for example, has been basically turned into charcoal. And that's also what happens with the scrolls. And I've done another video on that, so make sure you check that out. Over in Pompeii, we've got different conditions, but people are dying straight away. You will have seen their figures are often like this. We call this the boxer's pose. Now, if you've seen any victims from Pompeii, they're often fallen, hiding like this, or holding their face like this because they're suffocating. They're literally frozen in the last spot that they were hit. If someone was running, you've usually got them, they've fallen over because they've been hit by the flow. A lot of them are like this. They weren't doing this when they died. This is a result of something called a cadaveric spasm, which is where the muscles in the body contract when it's under very, very high heat. And you see this in fire victims, for example, today. So they were hit by this heat and their bodies contorted. And then the pumice and the ash solidified around them over time. Their bodies decayed. And later on, when archaeologists found the cavities that were left behind with their skeletons inside, they would fill this with plaster of Paris, and they would have the form of the person as they were in their last moments. The surges kept happening over time, and then we get to about 5:30 a.m. in the morning. These are hitting at intervals throughout the night. You might be thinking, how on earth do you know all of this? How can you know all of this with such certainty? Well, it's a combination of science and archaeological discoveries, but it is also a combination with an eyewitness account. I promised to tell you about him, so this brings me on to point 6, the surprising eyewitness account of Pompeii's eruption. So we have an eyewitness. What? From ancient Rome? This is mad. So we have 2 guys. Both of them are called Pliny. We have Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Elder was a general in the Roman army, and he was in charge of the fleet at Misenum, which is just around the bay in Naples. So he was actually watching the eruption from his villa on the edge of the bay and seeing it all unfold from across there. And who was with him? His nephew, Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger is a writer, just like his uncle. His uncle Pliny the Elder actually wrote the Natural Histories, a natural encyclopedia, pretty much the first one ever produced. He wanted to understand nature and life, everything from animals and vegetables to flowers and how the body works. We've got his younger nephew who, like Pliny the Elder, was a politician as well, but he was also a voracious letter writer, and we have his records of his life in Rome as a politician, or life on the Bay of Naples as an elite man in a luxury life with all his villas and his beautiful gardens and so on and so forth. So we have both of them and their records, and they're incredibly useful and interesting today. Actually, a lot of historians slag off Pliny the Elder because it's so boring. I don't think so. I'm a garden historian, as some of you might know, so it's just so useful for me. But the main thing is that we had an eyewitness account. Okay, so we've got Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger, and actually Pliny the Younger's mum as well, sitting in this beautiful villa looking out over the Bay of Naples. And a distress call comes to Pliny the Elder, the general, and they're saying something's going on, it's terrible over there, and they've already seen it. Pliny the Elder, in the meantime, has a bath. He does some reading, he has a meal, I think, and then he decides, yeah, it's time to go. I actually want to go and investigate this volcano for my encyclopedia. And also, he was a general of the fleet of ships, so he wanted to rescue people. That was his job. So he went with his soldiers over the bay into the sea, and his family never saw him again, unfortunately, but I'll come back to that. So Pliny the Younger is also watching. As I said, the column went up and out like a plane tree, and this was his description. So we now call it a Plinian eruption. This is actually a technical term in volcanology of that shape of an eruption. But they were obviously experiencing the ash coming across the bay. This is an almighty eruption, and we've had eruptions around the world that the ash has settled in countries literally hundreds and hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away. This is a big one. They're getting all of that as well. It's really dark and chaotic. There's pumice falling from the sky for them as well. It's not as heavy or big because it's not reaching as far. And what we found in the archaeological remains actually supports, or vice versa, the records of Pliny. But he's the one that gave us the date of the 24th of August, AD 79. But he did write it years later in a letter for a friend, Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, who then carried on that myth of the date. So I think he'd misremembered it. As we know, there's lots and lots of evidence to suggest that it was later in the autumn. We've also got the account of him saying the sky was darkening, there was trembling, and also people were flying from the city. Now we're coming to the end now, and I've got point 7 for you. Why wasn't the city of Pompeii frozen in time? I mentioned at the start, and I promised to go over it, why Pompeii wasn't a city frozen in time. As you've probably established by now through the hour-by-hour timeline of the eruption that we've seen, there was a lot of destruction over this time. It's not a matter of a big blanket of ash of meters high falling onto the city in one go. That would probably do it, but it didn't happen like that. There was destruction, and that is shown in the archaeological record. While the people seem to have been frozen in time, as I've now described, there was a process of their preservation and decomposition over time. The forms of the people that we have aren't actually forms. Some people have asked, are they like cement, or are they petrified people? Why did they turn to stone? They didn't. As we now know, these are plaster of Paris that was created by archaeologists later on, from around the Victorian period onwards up to now. We still do it now, and we can actually do it with root cavities as well. While it's an extraordinary window into Roman life, in AD 79, so it is a snapshot. It's not quite as straightforward as that. But saying that, the unique preservation of this town meant that we had, or the conditions of the eruption really, meant that we had paintings on the walls, we had furniture remains, we had even locks on doors, we had animal skeletons, we had people, we had amphora that were holding wine, you know, literally, you name it, it was there. We had graffiti, that's one of my favourite things. So, of course, these are all elements that I will be covering on this channel, so if you want to hear more about about it, this is the time to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell, because you will hear about any updates that come out of Pompeii first. I have exclusive access to archaeologists in the city. I'm supposed to be going there myself soon. So this is the place to come if you want the in-depth, inside updates. Now we're coming on to point 8, which is looters and life in Pompeii after the eruption. So what happened to Pompeii after the eruption? We last left it at 5 a.m. Over the next few hours, the pyroclastic surges have finished, and now it's starting to die down. But ash and pumice is still falling. So I said earlier that the ash and pumice was reaching ridiculous heights inside the city. It actually reached about 10 feet high. So it was going, into the second stories of the buildings that were in Pompeii. This is a huge height. It was falling at a rate of 4 to 6 inches per hour. So this is, like that. That's huge. You're not, after the first hour, you aren't getting out of there easily. After the second, you most definitely not. There's no carts or horses going out of there. But once you're getting to here, yeah, it's going to be really difficult. So you've probably got the biggest question left. How many people survived the eruption? So I said earlier that the population was about 20,000 people, or so the best estimates are at. And that's what I personally believe it was, about that. So I can go into that in another video, why we know that. We think that about 8,000 people perished in the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79. Maybe heights of 18,000 people that survived the eruption, which means about 2,000 people perished, and these would have included slaves that were tied up or unable to escape. And of course, this doesn't count the animal population either, the horses, the pigs, the dogs. The days and weeks that followed the eruption, survivors went back to the town to try and find the things that they'd left behind, and of course, a lot of them were incredibly disheartened and devastated to find their city was completely buried. The parts of columns and buildings were poking out of the ash that was now starting to solidify, and as the rain came over the autumn, this was solidifying even more. It was like a graveyard of the city. It was unrecognisable. These points of temples and buildings that were identifiable allowed them to navigate their way to where they would have lived, or where the public buildings were. The Emperor Titus at the time set in place relief efforts that would help the people of Pompeii. This included a fund, and it also included relief gangs of groups of people that would go and help people to try and recover what was theirs. They were also trying to recover public objects, so things like marble and bronze that could be used again, any statues that were particularly valuable, and anything else that they thought that they might be able to reuse somewhere else. But how did they get down there? Well, they dug tunnels down into the city. This is really important to remember, because later on, when archaeologists began excavating, they found these tunnels, and at first they thought, what on earth is going on here? They're going through actual walls and sometimes the length of whole houses. Well, they were trying to find treasure along the way. And some of these rooms would have been open, because not necessarily ash and pumice was getting into them as much as they would have been outside, of course. So we've got different levels of preservation throughout Pompeii. But inside these tunnels, devastatingly, the destruction continued, because some of them collapsed on top of the people that were trying to recover the items inside. So later on, archaeologists found these skeletons that weren't of that time. They were destroyed at a different time to the eruption, not long after, but destroyed nonetheless. And then we've got treasure hunters from many, many years later tunneled down, and again, the same thing happened to them, and there probably were toxic gases going on down there as well, and dead air. So we've got lots and lots of different layers of death and destruction going on here that continued afterwards. A lot of the forum, for example, and public buildings had been stripped of their marble and other items as well. So, for example, the statues from the forum were kept in a warehouse in the forum. When the eruption was happening, probably this they all took them all in just to be sure, because they would have been very valuable. And these were recovered. But also, you know, the outside of the Temple of Jupiter in the Forum was completely stripped of marble. And when archaeologists found it later on, they were really surprised to see that it was just brick. But that wasn't, of course, how it was before the eruption hit. And on top of this, the Emperor Titus thought, right, there's properties down there and items inside them of people that have their families have entirely perished. So we're going to appropriate those to help out the people that have survived the eruption and use that to fund them. Some diehard Pompeians lived in the areas around Pompeii or on the destruction site itself, but eventually these all went away and the land around it started to be farmed, and over time people started to live there again as usual. But it was never going to be the same. And within 100 years only, Pompeii was no longer marked on regional maps. Instead, at the crossroads where it used to exist, it says civitas, which means settlement. So somebody knew that there was something there. But apart from that, Pompeii passed into legend. That is a whirlwind of a timeline. I've touched on so many parts of Pompeian history, and there's so much more to discover and go through with you. I am your greatest resource because I have been doing this for over a decade, like I said. I am a world-leading expert in Pompeii, and I am tapped into the archaeologists and the people working on the site now on digs. So I'm the first to hear when something happens, which means that you too will be the first to hear when something comes out next. I'm so excited to see what's going to happen. But do let me know your comments and your questions about Pompeii in the comments section, and make sure you subscribe and hit that bell button to be the first to get the news. I'll see you next time.